The gavel cracked against the wood like thunder, echoing through the crowded chamber. Every head in the courtroom snapped forward, the weight of silence collapsing on the room in an instant. The air was heavy, charged, as if the walls themselves knew that something greater than procedure was about to unfold. Rows of reporters hunched over their notepads, lenses clicking with nervous impatience, while the gallery of onlookers leaned in, sensing history pressing at the edges of their breath. At the bench sat Judge Beryl Howell, her eyes fixed on the woman standing defiantly before her. Howell's voice cut through the tension like a blade, sharp and deliberate, each syllable designed to remind the room of who held the gavel, who claimed control. "Representative Crockett," she began, her tone coated with steel, "this court will not tolerate disorder, disrespect, or reckless disregard for its authority. If you persist, you leave me no choice but to consider sanctions against you." The words landed heavy, cold, and dismissive, the kind of language that drips with centuries of authority, spoken countless times to silence voices that dared to push back against power. A ripple of whispers moved through the gallery. Some gasped. Others shook their heads, muttering under their breath about the audacity of a judge threatening an elected representative in open court. Cameras snapped faster, reporters' pens darting across pages as though every stroke might capture the magnitude of the moment. Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. Standing poised in her suit, her shoulders squared and her eyes locked forward, she held the kind of composure born not from privilege, but from years of being underestimated. The stillness in her face was not fear, it was calculation. Every muscle seemed to announce, "I've seen worse. I've endured more. And I will not be broken here." Judge Howell leaned forward, as though her words had not been sharp enough the first time. "I suggest you think carefully before you speak again, Representative. This courtroom does not bend to grandstanding or theatrics." Her tone carried that familiar undertone of arrogance, a performance of superiority delivered with the comfort of someone used to being unchallenged. The room held its breath, caught between the judge's authority and the quiet storm building behind Crockett's silence. The press cameras clicked again as though trying to capture the exact second before an explosion. But Crockett's response would turn this moment into a national spectacle. The courtroom tension did not exist in a vacuum. To understand the gravity of Judge Howell's sharp rebuke, one had to see the storm swirling behind it, the layers of politics, pressure, and image that pushed her to single out Jasmine Crockett. Howell was not simply policing order, she was protecting a fragile perception of authority, a perception threatened the moment Crockett's voice pierced through the ritualized decorum of the court. For months, whispers had circulated in political circles that Crockett was becoming too bold, too visible, too disruptive. To her supporters, those were badges of honor. To the establishment, they were red flags. Howell, bound by both her own sense of control and the invisible expectations of those watching her from the shadows of power, had chosen this day to draw a line in the sand. Sanction talk was not just about Crockett's words, it was about sending a message. Stay in your lane. Know your place. But Crockett's lane was never meant to be narrow. She was a black woman in America's halls of justice, a representative of voices too often dismissed, carrying with her the weight of communities who knew the sound of being silenced. Every word she spoke carried more than personal conviction. It carried history, struggle, and the sharp demand that those who claim justice actually practice it. To muzzle her was not merely a procedural maneuver, it was a symbolic act, a performance of hierarchy designed to remind her, and everyone watching who supposedly ran the show. Reporters scribbled furiously, sensing that what they were witnessing wasn't routine judicial firmness but something far more combustible. The optics were undeniable, a judge in robes of authority clashing with a woman who embodied defiance against arrogance. In that collision, America's deepest contradictions surfaced. Was this chamber a place where truth could be spoken, or was it another stage where power dressed itself as fairness? As Howell's words reverberated, the gallery buzzed with muted reactions. Some tilted their heads toward Crockett with sympathy, others smirked, expecting her to fold under the weight of the threat. Howell herself, stern and composed, clearly believed the moment belonged to her. The sanction warning was her gavel thunder, her declaration that the rules of the game would remain hers to dictate. But beneath the stillness of Crockett's expression, something else was stirring. She was not rattled, she was calculating. Every ounce of experience she carried had taught her that moments like this were never about the narrow conflict at hand. They were about narrative. They were about who walked out of the room seen as small and who walked out seen as unshakable. And Crockett understood the cameras were not just documenting an argument, they were capturing a story that millions would soon dissect, replay, and remember. This was bigger than sanctions. Bigger than courtroom protocol. It was about whether a woman of color, elected by the people, could be openly diminished without consequence in front of the entire nation. The stakes had grown far beyond Judge Howell's attempt to flex authority. The battle now was over respect itself, over who had the right to speak truth in the spaces that pretended to hold justice. The press gallery leaned closer, sensing the ground about to shift. The murmurs stilled. The gavel sat motionless, but the true verdict of the day was no longer in Howell's hands. It would be written by Crockett, and by the millions who would soon see her response not as an outburst, but as a declaration. And with millions watching online, Crockett knew she had one shot to flip the script. To understand the sharp edge of Judge Beryl Howell's voice that day, one had to trace the arc of her career, a career built on command, control, and the polished weight of the robe. Howell was no stranger to the spotlight. Over the years, her name had surfaced in headlines tied to high-stakes decisions, rulings that rippled through Washington with the force of a gavel strike. Some praised her toughness, calling her a no-nonsense judge. Others whispered another truth, that her version of toughness often blurred into arrogance, her sense of fairness bending toward the convenience of the establishment. She was, in many ways, the embodiment of judicial power, precise in her language, theatrical in her rebukes, and unapologetic about the gravity of her role. To sit in Howell's courtroom was to enter a world where her word was final, her glare enough to silence even the most confident attorney. For years this authority had gone unchallenged. Those who bristled at her rulings often swallowed their anger, knowing that defiance could end careers or cripple cases. The robe carried not just the dignity of justice, but the shield of untouchability. Through it all, the personal toll was real. The late nights, the sacrifices of time with family, the constant barrage of critics who sought to reduce her to a caricature, these weighed on her. Yet she carried them with grace, knowing that the road she walked was not meant to be easy. She carried within her the stories of ancestors who had faced far worse, the strength of a lineage that refused to break. And in those moments when exhaustion threatened to take her, she reminded herself why she stood at all, because someone had to. Crockett was not molded by luxury or power handed down from above. She was molded by struggle, by rejection, by the endless fight to be seen in a world that often pretended not to see. That molding gave her something rare, a resilience that no sanction, no gavel, no dismissive glare could crack. Her presence in any chamber was not just symbolic, it was proof. Proof that dignity could walk into spaces built to exclude it and not just survive but stand tall. So when Judge Howell leaned forward in her chair, voice dripping with condescension, threatening sanctions meant to humiliate and silence, Crockett did not tremble. She remembered the professors who doubted her, the attorneys who dismissed her, the judges who overlooked her. She remembered every time she had been underestimated, and every time she had risen anyway. And in that courtroom, all of Crockett's history collided with a single defining moment. The silence that had hung like smoke in the chamber broke with the sternness of Howell's voice once more. "Representative Crockett," she said, pressing each syllable with the weight of authority, "I will not repeat myself. Your conduct in this courtroom treads dangerously close to contempt. I will not hesitate to impose sanctions if you continue down this path." Gasps flickered through the gallery. A man in the back row leaned forward, whispering to the woman beside him. Reporters glanced at one another, their pens suddenly still. Even the attorneys seated along the wooden benches shifted uneasily, some trading nervous glances, others staring straight ahead as though eye contact alone might draw them into the line of fire. But Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. She allowed the words to hang in the air, unbothered, as if giving them time to reveal their hollowness. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, measured, and carried the steady confidence of someone who had weathered storms far greater than the one before her. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she began, the words cutting through the silence like a clean blade, "sanctions don't silence truth. They only silence those too afraid to face it." A ripple moved across the gallery, gasps, muffled exclamations, the collective intake of breath from a crowd that knew they were watching something rare. Crockett hadn't raised her voice, hadn't matched Howell's tone with fury. Instead, she had countered steel with composure, arrogance with dignity. Howell's eyes narrowed, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair. "This courtroom," she snapped, "is not a stage for political theater. It is a place of order, respect, and the rule of law. You would do well to remember that." Crockett tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady, her body language unshaken. "And I respect the rule of law," she replied, her voice unwavering. "But I also know that law without justice is merely power in disguise. If my presence here disrupts the comfort of the powerful, then perhaps it is not I who need reminding." The room stirred again. An attorney sitting 3 rows back rubbed his temple, whispering something to his colleague who could only shake her head in disbelief. The press gallery scribbled furiously now, pens scratching against paper as though they might not keep pace with the drama unraveling before them. Howell leaned forward, her robe cascading like a shadow across the bench. "You are walking a dangerous line, Representative," she warned, her voice low but seething with controlled fury. "Do not mistake patience for weakness. I will not be undermined in my own courtroom." Crockett's lips curved into the faintest trace of a smile, not mocking, not dismissive, but a smile that spoke of resilience, of recognition that the moment was bigger than one exchange. "Respectfully, Judge Howell," she said softly, her tone steady as stone, "strength is not measured by how loudly one silences others. It is measured by the courage to let truth be heard." The gallery seemed to exhale all at once, as though the words themselves had broken the air open. The energy in the room shifted, rising like a tide that no gavel could hold back. Some in the crowd nodded subtly, others covered their mouths in shock, and the clicking of cameras punctuated the charged silence like distant thunder. Howell sat back, her face tightening, her authority suddenly colliding with something she had not anticipated: a refusal to bow. The robe, the gavel, the decades of judicial habit, none of it was enough to drown out the steady cadence of Crockett's defiance. For the first time, the judge appeared rattled, her usual control eroded by the realization that the room was no longer entirely hers. Each pause, each word, each silence between them felt like a sparring round in an invisible match. Howell struck with threats, Crockett countered with conviction. Howell tightened her grip on authority, Crockett loosened its hold with truth. And with every exchange, the tension climbed higher, until the room felt less like a courtroom and more like an arena where dignity itself was on trial. The crowd held its collective breath, waiting for the next strike, the next move, the line that would tip this verbal duel into something unforgettable. And then Crockett delivered a line that froze the entire courtroom. The silence stretched, taut as wire. For a moment, no one moved. All eyes were fixed on Jasmine Crockett as though the entire courtroom had been pulled into orbit around her. The weight of Judge Howell's last threat still lingered in the air, but Crockett stood calm, her composure almost unnerving. She did not rush her words. She let the silence breathe, let the tension settle, let the cameras focus. Only then did she begin. "Judge Howell," she said softly, her voice calm enough to force everyone to lean in. "You speak of order. You speak of respect. But order without fairness is just control. Respect without reciprocity is just subjugation. And I was not elected by the people of this country to stand silent while dignity is trampled." A murmur spread through the gallery, like the first tremor of an earthquake. Reporters glanced at one another with widened eyes, sensing history in the making. Howell's jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing as though she could burn through Crockett with sheer force of will. But Crockett didn't waver. She continued, each phrase clipped and deliberate, each pause timed with precision. "You threaten me with sanctions," Crockett went on, "as though the consequence of your gavel could undo the truth in my words. But sanctions don't erase injustice. They don't erase the double standards my community has endured in every courtroom, every hearing, every so-called chamber of fairness. Sanctions are a tool, a weapon of intimidation. And I refuse to be intimidated." Gasps rippled through the crowd, some covering their mouths, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The courage to speak such words in that chamber, under the direct glare of a federal judge, was almost unthinkable. Howell cultivated an image of neutrality, claiming often that the law, not personal preference, guided her hand. But critics noticed patterns. When establishment interests needed reinforcement, Howell's rulings seemed to lean their way. When dissenting voices pressed too hard, her patience ran short. The contradiction was glaring. A judge who spoke the language of impartiality while practicing the posture of hierarchy. She wore fairness like a mask, but behind it lay an instinct to defend the very structures that kept her elevated. This duality shaped the reputation she carried into the Crockett confrontation. To her allies, Howell was the seasoned judge who refused to bend to theatrics. To her detractors, she was the face of institutional arrogance, the gatekeeper who used her bench as a stage to remind challengers of their place. In both versions of the story, Howell played the role of power itself, unmoved, unmoving, convinced of her superiority. Her demeanor in court reflected that certainty. Every movement was deliberate, every tone clipped and controlled. When Howell leaned forward to speak, the entire room seemed to lean back, as though anticipating the strike of thunder before the storm. It was a performance honed over decades, the cultivated air of someone who believed deeply in the sanctity of her authority. And yet, beneath that performance, there lingered a truth she could not conceal. Power, once challenged, can crack. What made Howell especially combustible in moments like these was her conviction that defiance was not simply rude but dangerous. She regarded interruptions, sharp questions, or raised voices as direct threats to the integrity of her courtroom. To Howell, order meant silence. Dignity meant obedience. And so, when Jasmine Crockett dared to stand firm, when she refused to be cowed by the chill in Howell's tone, the judge reacted not as a neutral arbiter but as a ruler defending her throne. The contradiction sharpened. A judge entrusted to protect fairness was instead weaponizing her authority to diminish a woman who represented millions. A robe meant to symbolize impartial justice became, in that moment, a costume of unchecked control. Howell was not merely presiding over a case, she was asserting dominance over a figure whose very presence challenged her comfort, her worldview, her power. And this was why the confrontation carried such electricity. In Howell, viewers saw the familiar face of institutional arrogance, the official who cloaks themselves in process and tradition while silencing those who dare to press against the grain. She believed her gavel could end any challenge. She believed her words would echo unopposed. She believed, as she always had, that no one could outshine the robe. But arrogance, no matter how deeply rooted, is fragile when exposed to truth. Howell's certainty that the room belonged to her was about to collide with a force she had underestimated: Jasmine Crockett's resolve. For the first time in years, the judge's icy tone and sharp rebukes would not end the exchange. Instead, they would ignite it. The gallery didn't know it yet. The reporters scribbling in shorthand couldn't predict it. Even Howell herself, tapping her gavel with a rhythm of finality, had no idea what was about to happen. She had defined herself as the unshakable authority, the iron fist of the bench, the woman who could silence a storm with a single look. But even Howell's iron gavel could not prepare her for what Crockett had in store. Long before Jasmine Crockett ever stood beneath the glare of courtroom lights or the watchful lens of television cameras, she knew what it meant to be underestimated. She grew up in a world where the color of her skin and the sound of her voice often carried judgments before her words ever landed. She learned early that some people would hear her not as a person, but as a disruption. And it was in those very lessons of dismissal that she found her resolve. The resolve to never shrink, never bow, never let the weight of other people's arrogance dictate the measure of her worth. Crockett's childhood was not cushioned by privilege. She was raised in an environment where hard work was not a slogan but a necessity. Her family's sacrifices, their unyielding insistence on dignity, became the foundation of her character. Teachers, employers, even neighbors would sometimes underestimate her ambition, treating it as though it were too audacious, too grand for a girl like her. But Jasmine understood something they did not: audacity was survival. If she did not claim her space, no one would hand it to her. As a student, she excelled in the classroom, often outpacing those who doubted her. But her success was never enough to insulate her from the sting of bias. She remembers the professors who looked past her hand in the air, the advisors who hinted that perhaps her goals were too ambitious, the subtle reminders that she was a guest in rooms where others believed she did not belong. These moments could have broken her, but instead, they forged her. Every dismissal sharpened her will. Every slight became fuel. When she pursued law, the obstacles only grew heavier. Courtrooms, with their rigid traditions and entrenched hierarchies, were spaces where she was expected to play small. But Crockett refused to. She entered each case, each client meeting, with the full knowledge that she carried more than her own reputation. She carried the weight of every person who had been told their voice didn't matter, their story didn't count. In defending clients who couldn't afford powerful firms, in standing beside those who felt voiceless, she saw reflections of herself, and in those reflections she found her mission. The sexism was relentless. So was the racism. She recalls moments where opposing counsel spoke over her, where judges brushed past her arguments as though she hadn't spoken at all. Yet each time she anchored herself in dignity. She would not shout for acknowledgement, she would earn it. With carefully crafted arguments, with unshakable preparation, with the quiet certainty of someone who knew truth outlasts arrogance, she slowly turned skeptics into believers. Even those who dismissed her at first would later find themselves quoting her words, conceding her points, or simply respecting her tenacity. Her rise into politics was not planned as a career move, it was born from necessity. Crockett had witnessed firsthand how laws bent against the vulnerable, how policies written in sterile chambers hurt the very communities she defended in court. She understood that true change could not come only from arguing cases, it had to come from shaping the laws themselves. So she stepped into the political arena, armed not with family connections or corporate backing, but with grit, community, and the fire of lived experience. In campaign trails she was often underestimated again. Opponents dismissed her as too raw, too emotional, too unpolished. But voters saw something else. They saw someone unafraid to call things as they were. They saw a woman who spoke their language, who shared their struggles, who would not trade authenticity for approval. Slowly but surely Jasmine Crockett's name grew, not as another politician blending into the gray fabric of bureaucracy, but as a voice that cut through the noise with clarity and courage. Howell shifted in her chair, her knuckles whitening as her fingers pressed against the arms of her bench. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, unwilling to cede the floor yet unable to cut through Crockett's rhythm. Crockett seized the silence. "I know what it is to be told to know my place," she said, her voice steady but gathering heat. "I have heard those words in classrooms, in courtrooms, in boardrooms. I have heard them dressed as advice, disguised as law, wrapped in the language of respectability. But the truth is those words never meant order. They meant obedience. And I will not offer obedience at the cost of justice." The crowd shifted forward as one, every seat in the gallery suddenly straining toward her. Even the lawyers at the tables, hardened by years of procedure and protocol, could not mask their astonishment. A young associate scribbled notes furiously, while a senior attorney shook his head slowly, mouthing, "She's fearless." Judge Howell's composure began to crack. Her lips pressed into a hard line, the skin around her eyes tightening. She reached for her gavel but stopped short, aware that each strike would only sound like desperation. She leaned back instead, her breathing shallow, her posture stiff. Crockett's eyes never left her. "Respect is not commanded by volume," she said, lowering her tone, making the room strain to hear. "Respect is earned by listening, by fairness, by allowing even the most inconvenient truths to stand. You ask me to be silent in the name of decorum, but silence has never served justice. Silence has only ever served the powerful." The murmurs grew louder, a wave moving across the gallery. Some clutched their chests, others shook their heads in awe. The press gallery buzzed, cameras clicking non-stop, the electricity of the moment almost tangible. Crockett pressed forward, her words slicing through the air. "This isn't about one courtroom exchange. This isn't about a sanction or a warning. This is about whether a black woman elected by her community can speak truth in the very spaces where truth is supposed to matter most. And if that truth shakes the walls of this chamber, then perhaps it is the walls that need repairing, not my voice." The air grew heavier still. Howell shifted again, her face flushed now, her practiced mask slipping. She glanced at the clerk, at the gallery, at anyone who might affirm her control. But no affirmation came. The room was no longer hers. Crockett paused, letting the silence swell again before driving forward. "I will not be diminished, Judge Howell. Not here. Not anywhere. Because when you attempt to silence me, you are not silencing Jasmine Crockett the individual. You are silencing every person who ever walked into a courtroom and prayed that their voice would be heard. You are silencing generations who fought to sit in these chambers, who fought to be recognized as equal under the law. And I will not betray them by bowing to arrogance disguised as authority." The gallery erupted in a low chorus of murmurs, a suppressed applause threatening to break the rules of the courtroom. Even the bailiffs shifted uneasily, their eyes darting toward Howell, unsure whether to step in or simply let the moment pass. Judge Howell raised her gavel an inch, then froze, realizing how hollow the strike would sound now. Her authority, so long unchallenged, seemed to shrink beneath the weight of Crockett's conviction. The gavel hung in her hand like a relic, powerless against truth. Crockett leaned forward slightly, her eyes unyielding, her voice resonant with the force of every struggle that had carried her to this moment. "You may hold the gavel, Judge Howell," she said, her words slow, deliberate, devastating. "But the gavel is not justice. The gavel is not truth. And today truth will not be silenced." The words landed like a thunderclap, echoing off the marble walls, searing themselves into memory. The gallery erupted with audible gasps, some clapping before quickly silencing themselves. The press gallery exploded with activity, cameras flashing, pens racing. The electricity in the air was palpable, almost overwhelming, as though the very fabric of the chamber had been split open. Howell froze, her face drained of certainty. Her authority, once towering, now looked fragile, exposed under the glare of Crockett's defiance. She tried to steady herself, but her jaw twitched, her hands trembled faintly against the bench. For the first time in years, the robe looked smaller than the person standing before it. The silence that followed was deafening, the kind of silence that belongs only to moments destined for history. The judge sat stunned. But outside those walls, an even bigger storm was brewing. The echoes of Crockett's words had barely faded from the marble walls when the first clips hit social media. Raw phone footage uploaded from the gallery spread like wildfire. Within minutes, hashtags surged across platforms. Hashtag Crockett Unshaken, hashtag Truth Over Gavel, hashtag Dignity versus Arrogance. The courtroom might have been contained by stone and silence, but online the moment had detonated. On Twitter, the clip of Crockett declaring, "The gavel is not justice. The gavel is not truth," raced past 1 million views within the hour. By evening it had crossed 20 million. The words were already being set to music, looped into remixes, and blasted as TikTok soundtracks under videos of young activists, teachers, even students in classrooms reenacting her stand. Memes spread like sparks, Howell clutching the gavel as it dissolved into dust, Crockett standing tall with captions like, "Unbothered," "Unbroken," "Unstoppable." Commentators dove in immediately. Progressive voices called it a watershed moment, an instant classic in the struggle for dignity. A New York Times op-ed marveled at her composure, writing, "What Crockett delivered in that chamber was not just resistance, it was a tutorial in courage." On MSNBC, analysts played the clip frame by frame, marveling at how Howell's authority seemed to crumble in real time. One anchor declared, "We just witnessed a reversal of power that happens maybe once in a generation." But the backlash was swift too. Right-wing pundits fumed on cable news, calling Crockett disrespectful, grandstanding, even dangerous. Conservative politicians used the moment to raise alarms about chaos in the courts. Yet the more they tried to spin her as reckless, the more ordinary viewers replayed the footage and saw something else. Composure against arrogance, dignity against dismissal. Celebrities joined in. Ava DuVernay tweeted, "That's what grace under fire looks like. Crockett is a masterclass." John Legend shared the video with the caption, "When truth speaks, power trembles." Athletes, actors, and activists posted their own reactions, each amplifying the clip further. What had started as one courtroom dispute was now being framed as a cultural moment, one where the underdog didn't just endure but redefined the narrative. Politicians were forced to respond too. Some members of Congress praised Crockett publicly, noting that her refusal to bend was exactly what her constituents had sent her to Washington to embody. Others, more cautious, tried to remain neutral, unwilling to risk taking sides against a viral wave that was sweeping millions into its tide. By nightfall, news networks led with it. Panels debated what it meant. Was Crockett's defiance a breach of courtroom etiquette, or a bold refusal to let authority masquerade as justice? Even those who disagreed with her admitted one thing: the country was talking about her, and not about Judge Howell's sanctioned threat. What made the moment unforgettable wasn't just Crockett's courage, it was how clearly it tapped into something larger. For communities long silenced, her defiance wasn't an isolated exchange, it was validation. For young immigrants, for people of color, for those dismissed as outsiders, her stand said, "Your voice is not too loud, your truth is not too inconvenient." It wasn't just Crockett against Howell anymore. It was a symbol of people against systems, dignity against domination. The ripple effect only grew. Protest signs the next day bore Crockett's words in bold letters. Editorial cartoons depicted her towering over the judge's bench. Talk shows replayed the moment with dramatic music, positioning it as the scene that might define her career. And yet, as powerful as the memes and headlines became, what people truly remembered was not the sanctioned threat. It was the moral lesson Crockett left behind. In the days that followed, Jasmine Crockett made it clear that what had happened in that courtroom was never just about her and Judge Howell. She reframed the moment with the precision of someone who knew history was watching. This was not a clash of personalities, she told reporters. This was a clash between arrogance and dignity, between a system that wants to silence us and a people who refuse to be muted. Her words struck a chord because they carried something larger than the moment itself. People understood instinctively that what Crockett faced was something countless others had faced in workplaces, in classrooms, in offices of power: being dismissed, being underestimated, being told to sit down when their truth became inconvenient. By holding her ground, she gave validation to every person who had ever been told their voice was too sharp, their presence too disruptive, their very being too much. Crockett turned what could have been a fleeting headline into an enduring lesson. Dignity outlasts arrogance. Truth outshines power, she said in an interview that went viral in its own right. Those words became rallying cries, painted on murals, shared in digital posters, quoted in sermons and classrooms alike. It was as if she had distilled into one phrase the struggle of generations, and offered a torch for others to carry forward. Her supporters reminded the nation that dignity does not require permission. It is not granted by the powerful, it is claimed by those who refuse to bow. Crockett embodied that truth in real time, showing that composure and courage could be stronger than gavel slams and hollow threats. Even those who didn't align with her politics had to acknowledge the symbolic power of what she had done. The confrontation had started as a battle over order in a courtroom, but it ended as something much larger, a mirror held up to America. Were its institutions truly about justice, or were they stage plays designed to reinforce hierarchy? Crockett's stand refused to let that question go unanswered. And in doing so, she reminded millions that justice is not an ornament worn by those in robes or offices. It is a principle that lives in the voices of ordinary people willing to speak it. The crescendo of her message was simple yet revolutionary. Truth does not belong to the powerful, it belongs to those brave enough to speak it aloud. Authority can command silence, but it cannot command respect. Power can punish, but it cannot extinguish dignity. And in Crockett's defiance, people saw not just a courtroom drama, but a blueprint for their own battles. Teachers told students about her stand. Parents told children. Workers whispered it in break rooms. Activists printed it on banners. The ripple of inspiration traveled far beyond politics, crossing lines of class, race, and creed. Crockett had given people a reminder that could not be bought or sanctioned away, that dignity is the one possession no gavel can seize. And as the story spread, people began to believe again that the small acts of courage, the refusal to be silenced, the insistence on truth, could add up to something unstoppable. If dignity could triumph in a courtroom where the odds were stacked against it, then dignity could triumph anywhere. Judge Beryl Howell may have tried to sanction Jasmine Crockett, but history will not remember the gavel. It will remember the moment Crockett stunned the courtroom, stood her ground, and transformed what could have been a silencing into a spectacle of truth. That instant, captured on shaky cell phones, replayed millions of times online, has already become viral history. Because this was never just a courtroom clash. It was a lesson carved in real time. Calm courage will always outlast arrogance. Dignity will always cut deeper than abuse of power. Crockett's strength wasn't in shouting down her opponent, it was in standing firm, unshaken, and letting truth speak louder than threats. That is why this moment resonated far beyond those four walls. It wasn't simply about politics, or even about one judge and one congresswoman. It was about us. About every person who has ever been told to shrink, to sit down, to stay silent. Crockett showed us that silence is not the only answer, that dignity can be defiance and that defiance can be honorable. And now that lesson belongs to you. Because every share, every replay, every conversation about this moment is part of keeping its power alive. When arrogance tries to bury dignity, it is our voices that keep dignity rising. If you believe dignity always wins, share this video. Subscribe to this channel. Join us in amplifying the truth that calm courage is stronger than intimidation, and that justice is not a performance, it is a principle. Together we can carry Crockett's stand beyond the courtroom, turning one viral moment into a lasting movement. Because if dignity triumphed here, it can triumph anywhere.